there are 80-something slides here, and so I've divided this, instead of trying to dump it all on you in 90 minutes, I've divided it into two parts. One part today, this afternoon, we'll go through the embryology. Tomorrow morning, we'll go through the pediatric congenital malformations of the heart. You can't do that without first knowing the embryology, because of how things, you need to know where things got to in order to understand if they're not there, where's the defect. So here we go. There are 9,000 lecture objectives here, which start out with the development of the heart and get into a little bit of physiology, and then finally into the malformations there at the end. There's some radiology here that I'll show you, and then in the end you should be able to correlate the defect with the embryology. That's the point of this whole thing. So to start with, this is what you've probably seen before in physiology, and this is only the left ventricular side. This is only the aortic side, not the pulmonic side. But it correlates here with the S1 and S2 heart sounds. You should know where S3 is, if there is an S3. Is it in systole or diastole? So that's something you should know. You should also be able to correlate the sounds with the EKG. And we kind of went over this last month about where, what's happening with the P wave, what's happening with the QRS and the T wave and the segments, what's going on there. Understanding, of course, going back to phys die, what forms S1 and S2, or what causes S1 and S2, are the closure of the valves. So if you look, for example, at S1 here, the first heart sound, it's not the aortic valve opening that creates the noise, it's the closure of the atrioventricular valves at the beginning of systole. So at the beginning of systole, you're going to have, if you look at the blue line, this is ventricular pressure. You'll see that pressure accelerates. If you look at the pressure inside the aorta, it's going to start going up, and then they both decline. It's the decline right here in the aortic pressure as you now enter diastole that causes the backflow of pressure in the aorta, and the aortic valve closes. Then you have atriosystole, which is going to open the AV valves. Right? Now, here's the thing about this cardiology business, and this carries all the way through the boards. If you just stop and think about what's going on, then it's easy to get the question right. But you have to get the order of what's going on right. You have to know that in systole, the only systole you really care about is ventricular systole. That's going to close the AV valves and open the aortic and pulmonic valves. In diastole, the exact opposite occurs. So if you start thinking about murmurs from stenosis or regurgitation, you just have to think about it in terms of systole or diastole. And it's relatively easy to do. You just have to stop and think about it. Okay? Also, where these murmurs are heard makes sense. If this is the aortic, that's the pulmonic, that's the tricuspid, that's the mitral. You're going to hear them best like an aortic. I've been trying to get in touch with this guy for 2 days. So, You just have to, so if you have an aortic stenosis or an aortic regurgitation, then this is your place up here. Where is that going to, because of the nature of the aorta, where are you going to radiate those sounds? Up into the carotids. Okay, so we'll get into that more tomorrow when we start talking about these defects. But if you keep this in mind, be able to just work your way through it. That will be helpful to you. All right. So back when you were 3 weeks old, this is what you look like. You were a trilamellar embryo at 3 weeks. And at 3 weeks, you started developing out here in the plate rudimentary blood vessels. I say rudimentary, they're not organized, they're not connected, they're not pulsating. You just start developing channels that will connect to form vascular structures later on. At the head, this is going to be the head, that's going to be the embryo's tail. At the head up here, distal from the head, or what's going to become the brain. This is going to be your brain right here. In front of that, the embryonic tissue in front of that is right here. You have, again, vascular structures start to form, tubular type structures. And then there's a coelom that occurs in juxtaposition to that angiogenic cord at the head. So there's the coelom, it's a cavity. Different coelom, you know of different coeloms. The coelom that creates the pleural cavity, the coelom that creates the abdominal cavity. You have another one here. It's eventually going to be the pericardial cavity. Because this is the primitive heart, it's going to be surrounded by that coelomic cavity. Okay? Now, what happens the next week is that, remember, you've got the trilamellar embryo, then in the 4th week, you start folding. So these plates right here are going to fold around. And essentially, these are going to create blood vessels that are going to run down the side of the embryo, either side of the embryo. This piece right here is going to fold under, all the way under, to become the heart. So your heart actually starts out in front of your head. Kind of cool. Now, what I did, this is different from your slide. You have all, what I did, I just split the next slide into 2 to blow it up here. So here's what happens. These 2, oops, backwards. Why is it going forwards? Because I'm hitting forward button. These 2 things here are going to form 2 vascular structures. And that's what you have right there. 2 vascular structures. The coelom that was in the head region there, that's right here. The 2 vascular structures are inside now that coelom. If you look at this each side, it says in the illustration here, the dark part on the outside is the epicardium. Directly underneath that is the myocardium, and right here is the endocardium. Those are the 3 elements of the heart. This cardiac jelly here is going to go away. It's mesenchyme, it'll go away. But those are the 3 layers of the heart. You got 3 layers on one side, and 3 layers in the tube on the other side. Now this is early on. You're only a few days old, a few weeks old here. These 2 distinct tubes will fuse inside that coelomic cavity. By the end of about it's before 5 weeks, around 5 weeks or so, this is what you're going to have. A fused 2 primitive tubes into one tube. You're going to have two tubes going out the top, 2 tubes going out the bottom. But one tube. That's how your heart starts out, one tube. So the rest of the conversation is going to be, how do you get one tube into 4 chambers? That's the tricky part. Okay. Now, first of all, the chambers aren't stacked on each other, 1, 2, 3, 4. The chambers are, there's one up here, there's one there, and then there are 2 ventricles down here. They're not stacked on each other, so obviously what happens is folding. And this illustrates the folding that takes place. There are 2 different ways for it to fold. One of them is that it folds from right to left. So you get like that. You can see the bend in it like that. The second thing is that the bottom folds all the way to the top. So if you look at this illustration, this is saying primordial atrium. It's down here in the bottom. Truncus arteriosus, if you remember what the truncus arteriosus was, from the right ventricle you have the right ventricle, the truncus arteriosus, and then the right and left pulmonary arteries. So, wait a minute here, you got the truncus arteriosus up here, that's fine, but here's the atrium down here at the bottom. We've got to get this all the way up here behind the truncus arteriosus. Remember, if you look at the heart, so here's the right ventricle, left ventricle, there's the right atrium, right? So if you are looking at where it is now, it's down here. What we're going to have to do is fold it and put it up here. So there are 2 folds that happen. One is a lateral fold, and the other is a superior, an inferior to superior fold. Okay, well look here what we got now. We got umbilical veins, we got vitelline veins, and we got cardinal veins. We've got the aortic arches up here, aortic arches. Because this is part of the arterial system that's going to provide the aortic arches. We'll talk more about those in a second. But let's talk about these veins down here for a second. What are these veins? Here's our heart. There's the truncus arteriosus. This down here is the primitive atria. Feeding into that are 3 veins. We've got this posterior cardinal vein that supplies the posterior aspect of the embryo. We've got umbilical vein right there, and we've got the vitelline veins right here. The vitelline veins drain the yolk sac. Where does blood, erythrocytes, the first place erythrocytes are made are in the yolk sac. So as far as what does a yolk sac do for humans? That's one of the main functions, is that that's where your your blood comes from, originally. Coming out the top, now you've got aortic arches. But understand, there's no real venous and arterial here, because there's no lungs yet. Now, I don't want you to memorize all this. This is just, I want you to just appreciate this, because this is how you started out. I don't want you to memorize any of these 2 slides, this one or the next one. I'm just using these to show you a point. Here's the sinus venosus here. The sinus venosus, so on top of the sinus venosus would be the heart. The sinus venosus is draining into the heart tube. Draining into that sinus venosus are going to be the umbilical and vitelline veins and the cardinal veins. And you have different sets of cardinal veins. The posterior cardinal veins, as I said, drain the body wall. These ones in red here, called the subcardinal veins, if you were to put the embryo in it, you remember the urogenital ridge? The urogenital ridge, what gives rise to the glomeruli, the mesonephric. Amy is saying no, that was like yesterday, so no. The mesonephric kidney, the metanephric kidney, the pronephric kidney, all that stuff. And I drew that urogenital ridge. And I'll draw it again so you don't know what the hell I'm even talking about. So here's the embryo, and there's a ridge like that. Okay, here's your notochord. So this right here is the urogenital ridge. This is where your kidneys, I was talking about the vessels being contributed to the glomeruli. Where are those vessels coming from? Those vessels are coming from these subcardinal veins. These subcardinal structures drain or supply the urogenital ridge. The cardinal veins supply the body wall. Okay? And then you have anterior cardinal veins as well. We're not worried about those. Now then what happens is these vascular structures, they start either degenerating or fusing or branching. So you go from here and you start losing things, and things start falling apart up here at the heart, and well, you give it another day or two and all this stuff starts happening, and by the time you're born, all of these things have either fused or degenerated or changed location. So if you go through and pick out the parts of the venous system in an adult, they actually came from some place, and that some place was probably one of those cardinal veins. So here you can see down here, look what happens. At the bottom of the 2 cardinal veins, whoops, here, all you've got here is the 2 posterior cardinal veins. They join here at the bottom. But actually, by the time you get to be an adult, what happens is you've got a median sacral vein, and you've got 2 common iliacs. 2 common iliacs there that are going to branch into the external internal. So that's how it makes up. Well, what happened to the loop? The loop wound up degenerating, so you only had one side of your venous system that actually developed. A couple of points I want to make here. One is, this is incredibly complicated. And whenever you have things developmentally that are complicated, you introduce the likelihood that there's going to be a difference. It's not going to be normal. or congenital alterations are common. And I hope you can appreciate, because of all this mixing and matching, why you can have an enormous number of alterations in the blood supply of the kidneys. Look what happens all in here to the kidney, to the vascular supply of the kidneys. It's crazy. Now, when you get up here, you'll see that what started out as two separate blood supplies wound up crossing over, so you've got a left brachiocephalic joining the right, forming the superior vena cava. Part of that cardinal system is what gave rise to the azygos vein. Where does the azygos vein drain? It drains the body wall. Okay? Again, you don't have to memorize this stuff. But it is kind of interesting to just sit there and look at it and say, okay, well, that's where that comes from. This is why, if you look at the gonadal arteries and veins, they drain and go from different places. It has to do with the fact that the cardinal system degenerated. It got moved. All right. Now, here is the, now we're going to shift gears and look more towards the arterial side. So here we go, day 20. So that's 3 weeks, day 22, 24, now 4 weeks. That's when your folding started out. You've got the venous end here, there's the arterial outflow, and then what happens is you take this and you put it up there. So there's one atrium, there's the other atrium over here behind it, right there. You take the atria and you move them up behind the arterial system. So that's why you got the right atrium here. Where's the left atrium? The left atrium is back there. It's behind the ventricles. Because you took it and you moved it behind there. Okay? So this is what happens. It even defines the inferior part as the venous pole here versus arterial pole. Because here's your ventricle, there's the outflow right there. The truncus arteriosus is right there. We're going to take these, the venous pole is going to be the atria. We're going to take these atria and move them behind the ventricle so that now they wind up on the top up here. Because you know the heart is not a tube going from the top to the bottom of the pericardium. It's all suspended from the top, and the heart hangs down. Other than its attachment with the inferior vena cava, the heart is hanging free in the pericardium. Remember in anatomy I said you could put your hand behind the heart? The heart hangs free. That means all the attachments have to be at the top. The only one that's at the bottom is the inferior vena cava. So now we've got this atria, they're behind the arterial side. That's going to be the right ventricle, that's going to be the left ventricle. Now keep in mind, it's still a tube. It's just a tube with curves. So the blood would come down and go around and come. There are no valves, there's no septum. It's just a tube, a twisted tube. So if we were to open up the atria here, what we would see would be an open tube. The atria feed directly into the ventricles, which feed out through the aortic arches. Wait a minute, where's the aorta? If this is the left ventricle, where the hell is the aorta? You are how many, you are embryonic week 10. You're 2.5 months old. Where's your aorta? You don't have one yet. That's pretty cool, huh? By week 15, you do. We gotta figure out how to get yourself an aorta. Hang with me here for a few minutes. Let's back up and talk about the two atria. You see the atria are sitting behind the arterial outflow. I keep bringing up that point. The atria, embryologically, are behind the outflow of the heart. Well, this is what the atria, so this is, let's cut the heart this way. So we see an open atrium here. It's just a tube. Blood would come in here, go down to here, and out. It's just a tube. It's just bent. But now what we need to do is we need to take that one atrium and we need to divide it into two. And the process for doing that, it starts out, there are two things here. One thing you need to be aware of is this thing right here called an endocardial cushion. So an endocardial cushion is, if we've got the ventricle here, so let me back up. If we've got the ventricle here, you see that thing right there, that little nubbin right there? Nubbin of muscle? That's called a cushion. So in this other diagram, when it says an endocardial cushion, it's just one of those nubbins that sticks up into the atria. It's part of the ventricle. It just sticks up. It forms part of the atria. So you get this growth coming down from the top of the atria. Here's the atria. All of a sudden, the atria start growing down from the top. This is called the septum primum. The septum primum starts growing down from the top. It will actually start growing up from the bottom. But it doesn't form a complete membrane. There's a hole in there. That hole is called the foramen primum. And it's located at the bottom down here. I'll show you, this will become apparent in the next slide. Follow me here for a second. So we've got this sheet coming down, the foramen septum primum. It doesn't go all the way to the bottom. There's a hole at the bottom. That's the foramen primum. And then up here at the top of the sheet, holes start appearing and they coalesce to form another hole. That's the foramen secundum. So what you have is you have a septum primum for a short time with two holes in it. A foramen primum and a foramen secundum. The membrane down at the foramen primum eventually closes up. So the only thing you have left is a septum secundum. The second, not the septum, foramen secundum. The only thing that remains is the second order foramen. Now, as soon as you start getting that, then another septum starts growing down. That's called the septum secundum. And you can see that by this little blue thing right here. And it grows down in front of, or on the right side of the septum primum. And by right, so I'm taking, I'm looking at you. You're looking at the heart from this way. This is eventually going to be the right atrium. That's the left atrium. There's a hole that remains in the septum secundum. That's the foramen ovale. So right now, blood is not going to the lungs. You don't need blood to go to the lungs. You've got this hole in the atrial septum here. You don't need your lungs. Mom's giving you all the oxygen you need. So there's no venous return oxygenated blood coming back from the lungs into the left atrium. Right? So the left atrium is low pressure. So the blood flow will always be in that direction in a normal heart, from right to left. And I repeat that, in a normal heart. The blood flows through foramen ovale and through foramen secundum to enter the left atrium. When we view this another way, and this illustration is hard to see, but it's very specific. This side here is looking at the heart from the lateral side. So I'm just looking through the right atrium. This column here is I'm looking at it from the front. So I see both sides. So you can see the septum primum form. There's the foramen primum and the foramen secundum developing there. The foramen primum seals up, leaving nothing but the foramen secundum. Now you've got the developing septum secundum right there. It keeps coming down, but is incomplete, forming foramen ovale. So blood is going to go through foramen ovale, through foramen secundum to get to the left atrium. And that's how it works. But remember that both foramina are in septum primum. The foramen ovale is in septum secundum. So if you look at this view here, this is what we saw from the other side. You get over here, and here's the flap-like valve there. The septum primum actually forms a flap-like valve. Now, as soon as you're born, they clamp the cord, and you take your first breath. Blood enters the lungs, and it comes back into the left atrium now. And when the blood flows into the left atrium, the pressure now in the left atrium is higher than in the right atrium, and it will cause the septum primum to close. It doesn't close like it just pushes it up against the septum secundum. And when it's in contact with the septum secundum, it will fuse with it over the next several hours to days, sealing off foramen ovale, making it now fossa ovale. So tomorrow, when we start talking about congenital defects, there are times where we don't want that to happen. We want this thing to stay open because that's the only way you're going to survive. And I'll go through that tomorrow, okay? But knowing this process. So if I said you have an atrial septal defect, where's the defect? The defect is either going to be in foramen primum, it's going to be in the foramen or fossa ovalis, or there's one other place, and that is very high up in the atria up here, embryologically. You can have a hole high up because of the early remember, things were coming in from the bottom, right? The vitelline veins, cardinal veins, everything coming in from the bottom. Well, when you created the atria, we took that, remember how we took it and rotated it up? So we're taking everything that was coming from the bottom and rotating it up. And you can have a defect here at the very top of the atria because of that. So there are three places you can have an ASD. Foramen primum, the fossa ovalis, or foramen ovalis, and what's called a sinus transversus. We'll talk about that later. Okay? But that's how you get there. All right, so let's talk about the ventricles now. All right, so we have our two atria. They've divided off up here. They've divided off. But the blood coming from the atria is coming down into the one ventricle. So here's the one ventricle. We still don't have a freaking aorta. We have a truncus arteriosus. That's the right ventricle outflow. Here are those bumpy things. Those are the cushions, endocardial cushions. So what happens now is you have this ventricle, and in the middle of the ventricle and the top of the ventricle, you start having downgrowths. The bottom one is the one that grows up the most, because that's going to be the interventricular septum. It's a muscular structure that's going to grow up towards the top. So this right here represents the opening of the atria. It's a single opening. Remember, it's a single tube. What we need to do is we need to take this septum and we need to shoot it right towards the middle there to divide that one opening into two. Those will be your two, what valves? What valves will those eventually be? The atrioventricular valves. The mitral and tricuspid valves. The pulmonary valve is going to be up here. The aortic valve is going to be, well, when we get an aorta, we'll put it up there at the outflow. Okay? So what happens here is you start getting the septum to grow up, and these cushions to grow around, and they eventually will fuse. Now, as they're growing towards each other to make a right and left ventricle, this outflow here, right now we only have one outflow, right? Correct? We have to do two things here. We have to make two outflows out of that one, and then we have to spiral them, because you know the aorta goes this way, and the aorta goes up and over like that, and the pulmonary trunk goes behind it, and it divides into a right and left. So we've got to spiral them. So what happens in that truncus arteriosus there is you start developing these bulbar ridges. These bulbar ridges appear in the truncus. These two ridges are going to fuse. And when they fuse, then they're going to start spiraling like that. So I put a bunch of these pictures in here because it's a difficult concept, and whatever floats your boat will help you to understand it. Maybe one of these pictures will. What happens is we've got that one truncus arteriosus, but we've got to get two out of it. So you get the two ridges that form all the way across, and then they spiral and separate. And this is what you're left with down here. Now you have an aorta. So 10 years from now, when we're on the streets of Nashville, and I run into you, and I say, JC, what does that mean? You will say, well, that's the spiraling of the truncus arteriosus into division into the pulmonary side and the aorta. You start out as one, and that's how you wind up with two. And because they spiral, that's how one is twisted on the other. Okay? Any questions about that? Oh, I have more of these pictures of the spiraling. There's another one. And it's pretty impressive how much they spiral. And then once they get to where they're going to go, then they break apart or split apart. You have apoptosis of the medial portion of it here, the middle portion of it here, and that separates them into two structures. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. So here it is again. You can see the twisting. You can follow it into that. Now, this is pretty complicated too, right? You know about things like tetralogy of Fallot, transposition of the great vessels. Those things are congenital defects on this system. They didn't spiral, they didn't separate. A whole host of things will happen in those disorders, and we'll go over them tomorrow. But you have to understand how they were created. They were created at the top of the ventricles, like in tetralogy of Fallot. One of the problems is an overriding aorta. The aorta doesn't come out the top like this. It doesn't come out the top. It sticks down into the left ventricle. Why? It's because this fusion here didn't take place, or this separation didn't take place properly. And you've got this aorta that instead of being up here is now way down here. And I'll go over that tomorrow. Here's another example here of this. Now you have two atria, and now you have two ventricles. But what happens is the interventricular septum doesn't go all the way to the top. You have, it stops up here, and then you have down growth from the top down to meet it. That forms the membranous septum. So you have a muscular septum from the bottom, a membranous septum from the top. So if you were to look at them in cross-section, they would look like this. You have the membranous portion up here, muscular portion down here. If I ask you, where are you most likely to have a VSD? What would you say? The membranous septum. You're not going to have a hole in this. The hole will be right here. Always. Well, not always. 99.99% of the time. Okay? Why is this important? Why is it important? Because you're going to get some bad babies. You're going to run into some bad babies. You're going to run into murmurs in babies that can be innocent or can be lethal. The other thing is, I was up in Canada one time with hunting and fishing with a bunch of guys, and one of the guys was from Edmond. His son was in high school, senior in high school. And his best friend was lived next door. So he was 18, lived next door. He was on an ATV and flipped it and fractured his femur. So Guido is the guy's name up in candidate I was with, Guido, learned from his wife that Tommy fractured his femur. He was in the hospital having surgery to put his femur back together. Next day, Tommy is comatose. I don't know if he ever recovered, but he was essentially, he was comatose because he stroked out. How do you stroke out? What is going on? I just told you everything you need to know. What is the first thing that should have come to your mind?
Septal defect.
A what?
Septal defect.
A fat emboli. How do you get a fat emboli to the brain?
Through the
Fat
septum.
emboli is going to the lungs. How do you get a fat emboli to the brain? Through an ASD. And that's what happened. Or a VSD. Okay? Any questions about any of this? All right, so we're almost through with what I want to talk to you about today. So if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, we'll just plow through the next couple of slides, okay? So let's look to the arterial system here. The arterial system is just as jacked up as the venous system in terms of things degenerating and moving around. You've got one brachiocephalic, you've got an aorta, then you've got an arch with, you've got this thing going over here, this subclavian that's going to give rise to a subclavian and a common carotid. That's the brachiocephalic artery. You only have one, right? Because the other side, the subclavians and the common carotid come off separate. Why are they not symmetric? Why don't they just have two brachiocephalic arteries? It's because of all this craziness going on here. You started out when you were a tiny, tiny, tiny embryo with 6 arches. So these arches are here. The first 2 degenerated. The 5th one is rudimentary. So you really only have 3 arches. 3, 4, and 6. These arches started fusing and degenerating, and then finally what you wind up with is this right here that looks nothing like what you started with. There's the outflow from the truncus arteriosus right there. It's one outflow because you don't have an aorta yet. It's not until later on that you get an aorta, and these are going to be feeding the definitive structures from the arches. Your mandible is the 5th arch. The nerve of the 5th arch is the trigeminal. The nerve of the 4th arch is the 7th nerve. I think I got this right. So these structures in the head are derived from these arches, and each arch has an artery. Okay? And a nerve to go with it. And this happens very early on. 2 months now. You're 2 months into this. Now, why, and this is something I told you back in anatomy, and I wanted to show you today why it happens. You know that the left and right vagal nerves come down to the neck, and the left vagus nerve gives off the left recurrent laryngeal that goes around the ligamentum arteriosum and up through the arch of the aorta. The right one goes under the subclavian. Why? And it has to do with these arches. They both started off at the same place. They both started off going under the 2 6th arches, but then the 6th arch on the left went away, and you eventually wound up with an aorta, so that's where the left recurrent laryngeal nerve is under the arch of the aorta. On the right side, it stayed there, and that's why the right recurrent laryngeal nerve is associated with the subclavian artery, way up high. okay? You don't need to know these arches and things, I just wanted to show you why it's that way. My neighbor down in Cayman Brack, she has surgery and she's hoarse now. Why? What surgery did she have?
Thyroid?
Thyroidectomy. What'd they get? They got one of these recurrent laryngals, right? It's kind of interesting. She went to like Johns Hopkins to have, because she wanted to get the best, and they dinged her. You know, in all these years of telling people that the most commonly injured nerve in a thyroidectomy is damage to the lever, I'd never actually seen it until her, and she went to, you know, the #1 medical school in the world. So, all right, so.
Have you had your break yet?
Well, we've got one more slide.
Okay.
Do we need to have a break?
Yes, because Sally's shelf is here and it's like 70 or 80 pounds and it's Emily Bradley in the mailroom. And so she needs some muscles.
Okay, give her 15 minutes, we'll be there.
Have her wait at the ramp for 15 minutes here.
Where is she?
She's right outside.
Oh, right here.
Yes, outdoors. I can have her wait.
Can we take a break? Let's go get to the robot guys.